Next is chapter 9, the Gorgon's Head. This might not be a word you've ever heard before. A gorgon is an allusion to a Greek mythological figure. This was a female who had hair made of snakes, and her special power was that she could turn people into stone. So the Gorgon's Head is an ominous title for sure. And we have a simile here. It does say, describing the Monsieur the Marquis arriving to his chateau. It's described with a large stone courtyard before it, 2 stone sweeps of staircase meeting in a stone terrace before the principal door, a stony business altogether, with heavy stone balustrades and stone urns and stone flowers and stone faces of men and stone heads of lions in all directions, as if the Gorgon's Head had surveyed it when it was finished 2 centuries ago. So this is very much foreshadowing something bad is going to happen with all these people, quote unquote, turned to stone, which seems to define the entire chateau. And a chateau is like a magnificent mansion. It goes on with more sort of eerie descriptions. There is the Marquis heads into his home. He has a flambeau. This would be like a torch to light the way. There's an owl making noise. Besides the owl, everything is quiet, so that seems sort of spooky. And it says it's one of those dark nights that hold their breath by the hour together and then heave a long, low sigh and hold their breath again. So this is an example of personification. The great door clanged behind him, and Monsieur the Marquis crossed a hall grim with certain old boat spears, swords, and knives of the chase, grimmer with certain heavy riding rods and riding whips. So like in the hall, there's all these like weapons and things used for hunting on the wall, which goes on to say, which many a peasant gone to his benefactor's death had felt the weight when his lord was angry. So some of these things he would have beaten peasants with when he was angry with them. So he's a violent man. It describes the interior of the house as being elaborately decorated in the fashion of the later Louis but one. This was Louis XIV. Louis XIV would have been a previous king, and he was a ruler from 1643 to 1715. In chapter 7, there was another reference to Louis XIV. He was the king who gave a secret pension to Britain's king, Charles II. Then it describes that there is supper laid for 2. So if you remember in the previous chapter, Monsieur the Marquis is waiting for a visitor, his nephew named Charles. So we know from the previous chapter someone named Charles is expected. Of course, the only Charles we know is Charles Darnay from England. And he says it is his nephew. And the servant says he has not arrived yet. And the Marquis says, well, it's probable he will arrive tonight. It's not probable that he will arrive, but nevertheless, leave the table as it is. I shall be ready in a quarter of an hour. So 15 minutes later, he sits down to have dinner alone, and he hears a sound. The Marquis says, what is that? And he says, open the blinds. So he hears some sound that makes him nervous. And the servant looks out and says, there's nothing. The trees and the night are all that are there. And so he throws the blinds wide, and then the Marquis says, okay, close them again. And then they hear a sound, and it is Charles. It was the nephew of Monseigneur. He had been known in England as Charles Darnay. So it's confirmed here that this is the same person that we think it is. And when Charles Darnay enters, Monsieur received him in a courtly manner, but they did not shake hands. So they do not have a very warm relationship for uncle and nephew. And the Monseigneur says, you left Paris yesterday? Yes, I came direct, is what Charles Darnay says. And the Monseigneur, the Marquis says, from London? Yes. And then the Marquis says, you have been a long time coming. On the contrary, I come direct. And he says, no, a long time intending the journey. So what he's saying, obviously, is that he hasn't seen Charles for a long time. He's sort of giving him a dig there that, you've been staying away. And Charles says, well, I've had various business in London, which of course we know was that he was standing trial for treason. So he was a little bit occupied with that problem. So as long as there's a servant present while they're eating, they don't really talk about anything of any significance. But as soon as the servant has left, Charles says, I have come back, sir, as you anticipate, pursuing the object that took me away. It carried me into great and unexpected peril, but it is a sacred object, and if it had carried me to death, I hope it would have sustained me. No clue what this is. We are not going to find this out immediately, but there's some reason he has come back to his uncle's home. And the uncle says, not to death. It's not necessary to say to death, which is sort of ironic considering how death-like this entire first 2 pages of this chapter seem. And Charles says, I doubt whether if it had carried me to the utmost brink of death, you would have cared to stop me there. He's saying, you don't care if I die. So the description here of the Marquis, he's very haughty and doesn't have any sort of warmth about him. And Charles goes on to say, for anything I know, you may have expressly worked to give a more suspicious appearance to the suspicious circumstances that surrounded me. So he's talking about the accusation of treason. So clearly Charles was doing something, coming back and forth between London and Paris. Possibly not anything treasonous, but something secretive. And he's saying, maybe you actually caused my problem in London. Maybe you made people suspicious of me, because he doesn't trust this man, obviously. No, 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 says the Marquis pleasantly. So, but however that may be, resumed the nephew, glancing at him with deep distrust, I know that your diplomacy would stop me by any means and would know no scruple as to means. And then Marquis says, my friend, I told you so. Do me the favor to recall what I told you so long ago. Don't know what that is. I recall it. Thank you, said the Marquis, sweetly indeed. So, of course, this is very sarcastic. This man is not sweet at all. In effect, sir, goes on Charles, I believe it to be at once your bad fortune and my good fortune that has kept me out of prison in France here. And he goes on to make it clear that he understands that the reason the Marquis has less power to hurt Charles is because the Marquis is in disgrace with the court. Don't know why, but for some reason, he's a little bit in trouble, or he's fallen out of favor among his fellow aristocrats. And then what's interesting here is the Monsieur Marquis goes on to really complain about the situation for the aristocracy. He complains that things are not the way they used to be for the rich. He says, it used not to be so, but France in all such things is changed for the worse. Our not remote ancestors held the right of life and death over the surrounding vulgar, meaning the poor people. From this room, may many such dogs have been taken out to be hanged. In the next room, my bedroom, one fellow, to our knowledge, was poniarded on the spot for professing some insolent delicacy respecting his daughter. His daughter. We have lost many privileges. So what this is talking about here, this is actually the strangest thing. This is talking about the fact that in the old days, from the perspective of the Marquis, if a lord was going to have his daughter married off, that or even just any daughter, if any daughter was being married off within his realm, the lord had the right to have sex with her before she went to her husband, that's the insolent delicacy. It's so disgusting. So he's saying, we had all these privileges. We could do whatever we wanted with anyone, and now we don't have that. So he's upset about it. He shakes his head, as elegantly despondent as he could becomingly be of a country still containing himself that great means of regeneration. We have so asserted our station, he says, that I believe our name to be more detested than any name in France. So Charles is saying, we have pushed our privilege so heavy-handedly on the poor that everyone hates our family name. This is what Charles is saying. And Charles goes on to say, there is not a face I can look at in all this country around about us which looks at me with any deference on it but the dark deference of fear and slavery. So he hates the fact that everyone looks at him as a terrible person. And Charles doesn't want to be associated with that sort of aristocracy. And the uncle disagrees. Repression is the only lasting philosophy, he says. So they're having a very philosophical disagreement here, obviously. And Darnay just keeps pushing. We have done wrong and are reaping the fruits of wrong. And then he says, can I separate my father's twin brother, joint inheritor, and next successor from himself? And the Marquis says, death has done that. So what we have to understand here is that Charles's father was a twin to the Marquis, and that Charles's father is dead. And so the only person now who has the family wealth is the Marquis. And if the Marquis were to die, Charles would inherit that property and, that power. And Charles says, and has left me bound to a system that is frightful to me, responsible for it, but powerless in it, seeking to execute the last request of my dear mother's lips and obey the last look of my dear mother's eyes, which implore me to have mercy and to redress, and tortured by seeking assistance and power in vain. So before his mother died, she begged him someday to try and be good to the people. Seeking them from me, my nephew, said Marquis, you will forever seek them in vain, be assured. So he's saying, I will never be compassionate for the poor. Don't even waste your time trying to convince me that that's a good idea. So it goes on to describe the Marquis again. Every fine line in the clear whiteness of his face was cruelly, craftily, and closely compressed. Notice the alliteration here again, the repetition of C, cruelly, craftily, closely compressed, while he stood looking quietly at his nephew with his snuff box in his hand. Once again, he touched him on the breast, as though his finger were the fine point of a small sword, with which, in delicate finesse, he ran him through the body. So this is a wonderful simile. My friend, I will die perpetuating the system under which I have lived. So this is the epitome of evil. The Marquis is a terrible person. And Darnay says, this property in France are lost to me. I renounce them. And then the Marquis says, are they yours to renounce? And Charles says, I had no intention, in the words I used, to claim it yet, if it passed from me from you tomorrow. So he's just explaining to the Marquis that, he recognizes that he would be the person who inherits this property, and that he's saying ahead of time, I would renounce it. I would renounce the property. I would renounce my name. And so he says, I would abandon it and live otherwise and elsewhere. He would give it to the people. And he goes on to say, Charles does, to the eye it is fair enough, but seen in its integrity under the sky and by the daylight, it is a crumbling tower of waste, mismanagement, extortion, debt, mortgage, oppression, hunger, nakedness, and suffering. All of these things that Charles Darnay is saying could be quote test quotes. I just feel like these are the kind of things that demonstrate his moral backbone, and he's sort of speaking for really all of France when he says this, because this is how most people felt heading into the revolution, that it was oppression, hunger, nakedness, and suffering. And he goes on, if it ever becomes mine, it shall be put into some other hands better qualified to free it slowly, if such a thing is possible. So he's like, I would find some way to create a more, equal society on the property he owns. And the Marquis says, forgive me, but how do you intend to live? Because if you don't own the property, if you don't take taxes from the peasants, you aren't going to have an income. And Charles says, I'm going to do what most people do, and I'm going to work So these could be quiz questions. How does Charles Darnay expect to live if he's not inheriting land or if he's not living as an aristocrat? He plans to do what most people do and work. And so the Marquis says, oh, is that what you're doing in London? And Charles says, England is very attractive. Oh, no, I'm sorry. The Marquis says, England is very attractive to you, seeing how indifferently you have prospered there. So he is doing something to make some money in England. And Charles says, I have already said that from my prospering there, I am sensible. I may be indebted to you, sir. For the rest, it is my refuge. So he's doing his best to be independent. Then the Marquis starts prodding him a little bit about the people he knows in England. Like, isn't there a doctor there with a daughter? And of course, Charles acknowledges there is. And what's interesting is the Marquis seems to know a lot about it. There was a secrecy in his smiling face. There's sarcasm in the way he looks, handsomely diabolic. So, he's sarcastic and he's all-knowing. He seems to understand all the trauma that Dr. Manette has gone through. And he goes on to reiterate, a doctor with a daughter, yes, so commences the new philosophy. So he's like, oh, you're going to draft off those people. That's what you're doing. And then they end their conversation. The uncle says, good night. I look to the pleasure of seeing you again in the morning. Good repose. Of course, that is not the truth at all. He has no warm feelings for his nephew. So the monsieur goes to his bedroom. This is interesting. I look to the pleasure of seeing you again in the morning. Good repose. Light monsieur, my nephew, to his chamber there, and burn monsieur, my nephew, in his bed, if you will, he added to himself. So he asked the servant to take Charles to his bedroom, and then he says to himself, and burn him there, So he clearly, he hates his nephew. So then the Monsieur the Marquis goes to his own bedroom. Rustling about the room, his softly slippered feet making no noise on the floor, he moved like a refined tiger, looked like some enchanted marquis of the impenitently wicked sort in story, whose periodical change into tiger form was either just going off or just coming on. So this is a very long simile. He goes back and forth across the bedroom. He gets himself cool and relaxed so that he can go to bed. And then we have a lot of repetition here again from Dickens. For 3 heavy hours, the night is black. For 3 heavy hours, the stone faces of the chateau, lion and human, stared blindly at the night. Dead darkness lay on all the landscape. Dead darkness added to its own hush, to the hushing dust of all the roads. The burial place had got to the pass that it had little heaps of poor grass were undistinguishable from one another. This is referring back to that poor woman who had to bury her husband without a gravestone. It says the fountain in the village flowed unseen and unheard because everyone has gone to sleep. 3 dark hours, and then the gray water of both began to be ghostly in the light, and the eyes of the stone faces of the chateau were opened. So this is just a very interesting metaphor. Clearly, it's not like they literally open their eyes. Remember, these are just stone statues, but this is creating a shift in what's about to happen. And then slowly the sun rises. So lighter and lighter until at last the sun touched the tops of the still trees. As the sun is coming up and the birds are singing, the nearest stone face seemed to stare amazed, and with open mouth and dropped underjaw looked awe-stricken. Now the sun is fully up. It describes that the village is sort of getting started. People are coming to the fountain to get water. People are starting to go out and take care of their poor livestock. The day is starting. Some are praying in the morning. It says the chateau awoke later, as became its quality. So they don't need to get up because they're privileged. Gradually and surely. First, the lonely boar spears and knives of the chase had been reddened as of old, and then had gleamed trenchant in the morning sunshine. Now doors and windows were thrown open. Horses in their stables looked round over their shoulders at the light and freshness pouring in at the doorways. Leaves sparkled and rustled at iron-grated windows. Dogs pulled hard at their chains and reared impatient to be loosed. These are all the animals around the chateau. All these trivial incidents belong to the routine of life and to the return of morning. Surely, not so the ringing of the great bell of the chateau, nor the running up and down of the stairs, nor the hurried figures on the terrace, nor the booting and tramping here and there and everywhere, nor the quick saddling of the horse and riding away. So all of this is typical, but all of a sudden other things are happening at the chateau which are not typical. A great bell ringing and an alarm, people running everywhere, jumping on horses and riding away. What has happened? The winds conveyed this hurry to the grizzled mender of the roads. So the mender of the roads somehow finds out what's going on up at the chateau. His day's dinner is lying in a bundle that it was worth no crow's while to peck at on a heap of stones. So like the mender of the roads has like hardly any food. They're all just standing around the great fountain. And then it says, already the mender of roads had penetrated into the midst of a group of 50 particular friends. So these are all the village people standing around the fountain, and was smiting himself in the breast with his blue cap. So remember, the mender of the roads was the man who told the Monsieur the Marquis that he had seen someone hanging on underneath his carriage, and he had used his blue cap to sort of gesture under the carriage to show where he had seen the man. And so this is a reference again to his blue cap. And I do think it's relevant to sort of note that detail. It's going to sort of be a symbol that he is a revolutionary. What did all this portend, and what portended the swift hoisting up of Monsieur Gabelle behind a servant on horseback, and the conveying away of the said Gabelle, double laden though the horse was, at a gallop, like a new version of the German ballad of Lenora? So Gabelle is in danger. So Gabelle, after the mender of roads enters the group and starts to tell them things, because he's beating himself in the breast and telling them things, Gabelle, because of whatever the mender of roads says, is in danger. Remember, Gabelle is the postmaster. The postmaster, besides like we would think of a postmaster as someone who delivers mail, the postmaster also in this realm delivers tax bills. So he's the person who would have been collecting taxes for the Monsieur the Marquis, and he is suddenly in danger. So as a reader, tons of questions here, like what the heck happened up at the chateau that everyone is talking and Gabelle has to hop on a horse and get away. It portended that there was one stone face too many up at the chateau. So remember, the Gorgon's head turns people into stone. The Gorgon had surveyed the building again in the night and had added the one stone face wanting, the stone face for which it had waited through about 200 years. It lay back on the pillow of Monsieur the Marquis. It was like a fine mask, suddenly startled, made angry and petrified. Driven home into the heart of the stone figure attached to it was a knife. Round its hilt was a frill of paper on which was scrawled, "Drive him fast to his tomb, this from Jacques." So, if you haven't already figured out, the Monsieur the Marquis was stabbed in his sleep. So the one stone face too many is the dead Marquis. The shift over here where all the stone faces open their eyes and wake up, it's when they realize, figuratively realize, because of course they're stone, that the Marquis has been killed. And this could be a quiz question. There's a piece of paper on the knife that says, "Drive him fast to his tomb, this from Jacques." Remember, Jacques is a name, code name for the revolutionaries. So, important details here. Charles Darnay is the Marquis's nephew. He does stand to inherit this property if anything were to happen to the Marquis. He renounces the name and the land. The question, of course, is who killed the Marquis? I suppose we could say, did Charles kill him? Of course, Charles is already in enough trouble, and Charles doesn't want the land, so I would be sort of, I don't know, confused as to why he might make that choice, but I suppose it's possible. I mean, what about the mender of the roads? What about the person underneath the carriage? We don't know whatever happened to that person that the mender of the roads saw, but someone has killed the Marquis.